The idea of managing channel catfish population to produce memorable length fish came up after a recent extended conversation with one of our Omaha catfish anglers, and he was particularly concerned about how we manage all of our reservoirs in the Omaha area in a similar fashion. So he brought up some interesting points. So the authors in this talk, we all took a part in this presentation, and I thought it made for a good talk for this presentation. So one of the first things we did was kind of look at some past surveys that had been completed on catfish anglers, and I found this quote right off the bat. It said, "Past surveys indicate catfish anglers are low-tech bait anglers of modest means that fish rivers from shore at night and are harvest-oriented." I thought maybe they missed a few adjectives in there, maybe like smell like shad. No. So I think that idea kind of influences a lot of how catfish management is conducted, and I don't think southeast Nebraska is probably much different than that. We're bordered on the eastern boundary by the Missouri River, the northern boundary by the Platte River, and then we have about 120 lakes and reservoirs within our district, and we manage them in a pretty similar fashion, where there's a 5-bag limit on our lakes and a 10-bag limit on our rivers and streams. So pretty similar fashion. There's a few exceptions here. Jenny Newman and Barada are small park lakes that are managed with a catch and release regulation, and we do produce some larger catfish in those situations. Flanagan Lake is a 200-acre reservoir that was recently opened, and it was opened with a catch and release regulation just to allow the fishery to develop, but that's scheduled to be taken off here, and new regulations are probably going to be applied on that. This Two Rivers SRA, it's a series of 4 small park lakes, and 2 of them were managed with a catch and release regulation for catfish. And the one exception here is Wildwood Lake, and you'll hear that about that reservoir throughout this presentation. It's about a 100-acre lake, and we've managed that with a catch and release regulation since 2002. So I also found a survey conducted by Brendan in 2001, and he looked specifically at catfish anglers in Virginia, and he did a cluster analysis, and he based his grouping on occasional generalists, experienced generalists, avid, and specialized anglers based on their experience, participation, investment, and centrality. And he then compared how each of these groups might differ. So if they fish from a boat, as the arrow increased, it became more important so the experienced generalist and the specialized angler, fishing from a boat was more important for them. Catch was most important to the avid catfish angler. Harvest was most important to the experienced generalist, and then the specialized angler, trophy and the number of days fished was most important for them. And I think if we did a similar survey, we'd probably find something similar to this. One thing I thought was interesting was how the percent of catfish anglers distributed throughout these groups. The generalist was the lowest percent of the catfish anglers, and the avid was the highest. And there's also almost 50% of their anglers were specialized or avid catfish anglers. So southeastern Nebraska catfish anglers, there was a survey conducted by Hurley, and he's going to be giving another presentation, I think right following this one and one of the other ones, and he's always pretty entertaining. It's probably well worth the effort to go over that one. But he looked at, of the 77,000 anglers in southeastern Nebraska, about 20% of those anglers were designated as they preferred to fish for catfish, and over 50% of our anglers in that area at least took one trip fishing for channel cat or for catfish. So they're a significant part of our anglers there, and I think that we need to recognize that when we're doing any fisheries management. They also asked a question about Nebraska anglers that fish for catfish. How many do you harvest? And about a third of them I would consider fairly harvest oriented, with all, many, or half represented by a third of those anglers. But it also gave some credence to the idea that not all of our anglers are similar. We also had a few, or 2/3 of our anglers that only harvested few or no channel catfish. So one of the things we wanted to look at was, is southeastern Nebraska capable of producing some memorable length fish? And we used the number of Master Angler Awards from 2008 through 2018, and a Master Angler catfish is considered 30 inches in Nebraska. And we had about a little over 50 of our lakes and reservoirs that had produced some memorable length catfish, or some Master Angler Awards. And we had maybe a dozen or so that had a propensity to produce a few more Master Angler Awards than other lakes. And I'm going to focus a little bit here on Wagon Train Reservoir. It had some of the highest number of Master Angler returns. And I'm going to look a little more specifically at the channel catfish that we sampled with gill netting from 2008 through 2018. And we saw about 16% of our population was represented with fish over 28 inches, and about 34% were over 24 inches. So this is a similar graph representing the same time frame, 2008, 2018. This is the number of catfish we sampled in gill nets in Wildwood Reservoir. And again, we had a pretty significant population in that 28-inch range, which was about 26%. Over 56% of our population was represented with fish over 24 inches. So fairly top-heavy type of a reservoir that we've managed this with that catch and release regulation since 2002. And we also manage it a little bit differently as far as how we stock it. We stock it with about a third of the fish on an every other year basis that we would typically stock in one of our other reservoirs. So we are trying to manage it for a little lower density, try to improve growth rates and size structure there. And this is what's represented with the gill netting samples, and we combined all of our Omaha reservoirs into a single graph just because we didn't see differences between any of those reservoirs in that area. And the sample size, we had over 1,000 fish represented in this graph, and we only saw about 1.4% of our population over 28 inches and 3.6% over 24 inches. And when we look specifically at mortality rates, we have a pretty steep mortality after that 400 millimeter range, and we estimated annual mortality at about 45 to 65%. So you're going to see that represented in some of our evaluations as we go forward. So we use FAMs to model some of these our catfish populations from Wildwood Reservoir. We used that gill netting data from 2008 to 2018. We'd collected spines on 5 of those years, and so we assigned ages based on the frequency that we had in our spine sample. And so we increased our sample size up to about 270 fish. And some of the outputs, the von Berlanti growth function, and looks like it takes about 8+ years for our catfish to reach that memorable length size. We estimated natural mortality at 14%, and this is in a catch and release regulated reservoir. So there was obviously some hooking mortality going on there, or some illegal harvest that we certainly were probably experiencing in that population. We varied in our outputs the fishing mortality from 25 to 75%, and we used that by 5% increments. We did this because Wiley, and he's a grad student in 2013, found channel catfish exploitation rates ranging from 5 to 73%, but most of them were skewed more toward the middle of that. This is some of the length limits that we applied that we felt would be the most successful in this situation. And we started out with a 15, a 20, 24, 26, and 28-inch minimum length limit. You can see that we had a pretty significant decline in the number of fish harvested as we increased the length limit up to that 28-inch minimum length limit. And then within the box we have there that demonstrates kind of what our Omaha angler Omaha catfish populations were experiencing. And we also saw a slight increase in the number of fish harvested as we increased that fishing mortality up to 65%. The mean total length of fish harvested, again, we saw it increase with an increase in the length limit, which you'd probably expect. We didn't see as significant effect of fishing mortality on our fish populations except on these smaller length limits. The mean total length was starting to approach a memorable length with the 26 and the 28-inch minimum length limit. And then this is the number of memorable length fish that we saw in our population. Again, most significant effect was a 28-inch minimum length limit. We saw a fairly stable population of number of memorable length fish. 26-inch length limit you'd think would be fairly effective, representing closer to this what we would have expected with that memorable or that 28-inch minimum length limit, but it just wasn't the case. And we also see a pretty significant increase in fishing mortality. And again, these are pretty high-use reservoirs. We've done some estimates on these things where we're seeing about 300 to over 1,000 hours per acre, and that's probably affecting that high mortality here. So we didn't feel like we were going to get a lot of buy-in from our administration as far as putting a 28-inch minimum length limit on these. So we felt like we would try some other options. So the first two we tried was a 10 to 14 and a 15 to 18-inch minimum length limit. The 10 to 14 would have functioned somewhat as a maximum size limit because we stock most of these fish at 9 to 10 inches. But they actually function in a fairly similar fashion, but they weren't reaching the extent of what we were actually looking for with that 28-inch minimum length limit. So we dropped another length limit in here with a 15 to 17 and a 10 to 12 inch. Again, it was a pretty tight slot. We didn't feel like we'd get a lot of buy-in from our anglers, but it did get us closer to what we were looking for with the number of memorable length fish. So just a summary, it takes 8+ years to reach a memorable length catfish. We're seeing 45 to 65% annual mortality in our Omaha metro populations. Even under a catch and release regulation, we had about 14% natural mortality. We saw some differences in avidity and harvest tendencies among our southeast anglers, and we know we have the capacity to produce some memorable length fish. And under high fishing pressure and mortality, it takes some fairly extreme regulations to produce some larger channel catfish. So with that, I'm glad to try to answer some questions you might have.